Welcome to the GRE Reading Comprehension Intro. In this video, we are going to talk about the different kinds of reading comprehension questions you can expect and the actual layout of the verbal section and how the reading comprehension section questions will appear. That way you can anticipate and pace yourself better on the section. So first off, the reading passage, how long is it? Which is, of course, is always an important question from a pacing standpoint. You could have a very short 80-word reading prompt, or you could have one that is as long as, sometimes even slightly longer, maybe 457 words long, I think is the longest one that I've ever counted. So quite a range. Now the answers to these questions, and this is important, will always be based on information in the passage. So you do not have to bring in outside information, nor should you begin to despair if you realize, as is the case with many reading passages, that they are on some hopelessly obscure topic that you know nothing about. Everyone is on an even playing field. Most people don't know anything about that. And even if someone knows something about that, it doesn't really matter. Again, all the information that you need will be contained in the passage. In terms of the number of reading comprehension questions, they're actually the exact same as the number of text completions and sentence equivalence questions, meaning there are 10 each, 20 questions total. The order, and this is important, is always the same. And later in this video, I'm going to show you exactly where you can expect the text completions and where you can expect the reading comprehension questions. And this is really going to help you from a pacing/strategizing standpoint. Therefore, you'll know how to better work through the section and pick off those questions that you feel most comfortable answering. First, though, let's talk about the actual prompt format, because not every reading passage, as you got from the other slide, is the same length long, nor does every reading passage have the same number of questions after it. So let's start with that short reading passage. It's about 100, 120, usually less than 140 words long, and usually has 2, though sometimes it even has 3 questions after it. Then there is the medium passage, which is usually around 190 to 250 words long, so it jumps up a little bit. And there's usually, I would say, 3 questions if I had to find an average, but expect anything from 2, sometimes even as many as 4 questions after a medium passage. Finally, that leaves us with the long reading passage, which again is upwards of 450 words, but can range anywhere from 350 to 450. It is always followed, however, by 4 questions. So you know, if you're reading a long reading passage, get ready for 4 questions, one after the other, relating to that passage. Finally, there's something called a paragraph argument, which is the one that accounts for the 80 words, meaning there usually aren't too many words next to a paragraph argument. Also, what's important is there is always 1 question, and never more, to the paragraph argument question type. Now let's talk about question format. Most of the question format will be what you have come to expect on almost every standardized test, and that is 5 possible answers, one of which is correct. So that's business as usual. What is not as common, or what is typical or very specific to the GRE, is the multiple answer question. What this means is that there will always be 3, not 4, 5, 6, etc., but exactly 3 answer choices, any which can be correct. So you could have answer choice B, that could be an answer. You could have A and B, or you could even have A, B, and C, or some variation of 2 possible answer choices. It's usually very straightforward that you're dealing with a multiple answer question on the reading comprehension section, because again, there is always 3 possible answers, and they have these little brackets around them. Next, there's the select the sentence question. This one's actually very rare, unlike the multiple answer question in which you may see 2 or 3 in a section. You may go through an entire section without even seeing a single select the sentence question. Again, this is where you look into the passage and you actually highlight the question. Now, there is a separate module for this, because I know this is an odd question type, so you may want to take a look at that module afterwards to see exactly what this question looks like. Now for the layout of the verbal section. Why this is important is anticipation, pacing, and strategizing. You want to know where the questions are so you can figure out how much time you can budget. You will also have your strengths and weaknesses, and if it turns out that reading comp, after doing all these modules, becomes one of your strengths, well, it's good to know that text completion comes at the beginning, and you may want to go directly to the reading comprehension section. Of course, this will depend on your skill set, but here we have the layout. Reading comp is sort of sandwiched between the vocab, and at the very end as well, you will also have reading comprehension. Now, where it gets a little bit more specific is the first round, questions 7 through 11, usually have the long passage. That is one of the sections you will see tests. They have a long passage and a paragraph argument, or 2 short passages. As for the long passage, you will only get 1 long passage per GRE test, meaning out of the 2 verbal sections, only 1 will have that long passage, which of course is good news given the length. 12 through 15, we know, is the sentence equivalence, which will be followed by, again, the other reading comprehension, which usually consists of medium passages and a paragraph argument. So if you count, you typically get 2 paragraph arguments per verbal section. You may actually do very well in reading comprehension, but be full of fear or trepidation when dealing with a paragraph argument. So it's good to know where those occur in the verbal section. Now, this is more or less what you'll see almost every single time. There may be a slight variation in terms of the long passage coming between questions 16 and 20. Could happen, but for the most part, this is what you're likely to see, and you will always see text completion before the first batch of reading comprehension, and you will always see reading comprehension last with the sentence equivalence in between the 2 reading comprehension parts. The takeaways from all this, of course, is, again, the pacing, but it's important to know your own strengths and weaknesses. RC can take longer for most than TC and SC, but of course that depends on your own skill set. What I've found, though, is that students typically struggle with the triple blank text completions the most out of the text completions and sentence equivalents, and of course struggle the most in RC with either the tough long paragraph argument question or, and this shouldn't be too surprising, the very long passage, which in addition to having hard questions requires you to do a lot of reading. Now, to familiarize yourself with your strengths and weaknesses, with the outlay or layout of the test, the way that you can expect sentence equivalence in between reading comprehension, etc., is to actually do practice tests. That way you don't have to find yourself memorizing what you just saw. You've actually experienced it, and you can already adapt your strategy to your strengths and your weaknesses. We are going to begin this lesson on what a GRE passage is not. Now, this may actually come as a surprise to you. If you read this paragraph, and of course you don't see the big words up here saying this is not a GRE passage, you would very likely think that, hey, this sounds like a GRE passage. But what's the difference? What's going on here that makes this not a GRE passage? So what I want you to do actually is to read this really quickly. It will probably take you about 45 seconds. Okay, I assume you have paused the video, and let's get back to why this cannot be classified as a GRE passage. First off, it's very factual. It just lists a theory here and then just backs it up with specifics. Sounds like good writing. That's what we're taught to do. And there's nothing wrong with this. However, a GRE passage will not just give you one theory and then back it up with some facts at the end. It will give you a theory, but then it will show you how that theory is in some way lacking or wrong. Then it will bring in other views. It could be the author's view, it could be other scholarly views. And all of this, of course, is contained just in the short passage. So whenever there's a short passage, what you're going to see is something more like this. Again, I encourage you to pause this, and it may actually take you a little bit longer, maybe a minute and 20 seconds. Okay, what's the difference here? Well, one theory is introduced, then right off the bat we see the however, that this theory is shown to be wrong, and then there is evidence provided for why this is wrong and what's likely going on. In this lesson, I'm going to dissect the short passage and show you how all these parts fit together so that you can better anticipate information as you go through a short passage on an actual test. So let's talk about the ingredients of the GRE passage. What makes a GRE passage a GRE passage? As I said, there's an old theory or an explanation that is being challenged. Not that's just being listed, described, and supported, but it's being challenged by a new one. And this is usually the case in science passages. Slight variations are found in the debates that you will see typically in social science passages. There's an issue, and there are two sides to the issue. The author introduces those sides and usually takes a position, or sometimes the author is the other side. That is, the author's position is one side of the debate. In more literary themed passages, the author will just completely take over and present his opinion or her opinion. In doing so, they will mention other opinions and what's lacking about those opinions. But as you can see, really the ingredients is a debate. Something is being challenged for a reason and evidence is being provided. Now, before we go on and actually take apart the short passage sentence by sentence, a quick bit on what these passages are about. As you've noticed, they're pretty esoteric. That is, they are on subjects that most people don't know much about. We saw here science, paleontology, dinosaurs, type of blood. That is, as we go right, it becomes more specific and we end up with the kind of blood that the dinosaurs had, or were they cold-blooded, warm-blooded, hot-blooded, something in between, etc. Very specific. You are not going to get something at this level, of course not at this level, which is a textbook, or even this level, but something very few people have information about. The logic is you do not want to give certain test writers or test takers an advantage. For instance, I've actually taken this from the actual official GRE guide. This is a short passage. It's taken from the social sciences, feminist studies, more specifically leisure and class and feminist studies, which is amply esoteric, yet it goes even further by taking us to the advent of bicycles at the turn of the 19th century and how that influenced feminism. Again, that's very specific. There's probably 4 people in the entire nation who know anything about that. And again, that's to level the playing field. So, as I mentioned in the very first lesson video to the reading comprehension section, don't feel you have to know anything about this because no one does, and all the information you need is contained in the passage. Now to the structure. First off, you may have noticed I underlined that word however in an earlier passage in this lesson to show you that there was a shift away from the first theory. These structure words are important. However is very common, yet is also common. And sometimes you don't just have a word, but an actual phrase. A new theory has emerged, or recently scientists have found. So there's a shift away from the old line of thought, the old story, the story being displaced. So here it is. The first sentence will introduce or describe this topic of what I call controversy, debate, or mystery. Here we have a sentence that fits the bill. Most scholarship into the sudden disappearance of the Olmec civilization has focused on the decreasing conditions favorable to subsistence crops. So it's introducing the topic by showing us what most scholars have thought. As soon as you read the sentence, you know that there's going to be an opposing point of view. Most scholarship has focused on subsistence crops. Guess what? They're going to be focusing on something else, a new angle. Much of this research, however, notice the structure word there, however, has overlooked the role that changing geography plays. Now what's going to happen? Well, if you're coming up with this new theory, you need to provide some evidence. The key when you are reading this is to understand this evidence. You don't actually have to, absorb every single detail as you read, but you have to have a sense of what these details are doing in terms of the overall flow of the passage. Of course, once you're actually dealing with a question that deals with this evidence, then you can go back to the passage and look for any specific details that you need. For instance, here I have the specific detail of, and I'm going to try to pronounce this, though I probably shouldn't, the Coatzacoalcos River. The main river passing through La Venta could have had notable tributaries diverted as a result of climate change, leading to not only severe flooding, etc. So here is the evidence. You do, of course, want to read each word, but If it feels a little bit tedious towards the end, know that again, you can come back to this if the question asks about it. That, however, is not the entire short passage. And it's tempting to think, okay, that's quite a lot. They've provided another point of view and evidence. But what happens is there are additional theories. Yes, in these short 130, 140 word passages, there's quite a lot packed in there. So here, you're going to get an alternative theory or a concession, or the author is going to inject his or her own opinion about this alternate theory. Maybe they'll agree, maybe they will agree somewhat, hence the concessions, or maybe they will completely disagree with it. Now, the thing is, many questions relate to this part of the text because it's subtle what's going on. The author's taking a position somewhere in between. It's not black and white, and so you have to be able to pick up on these subtleties. Let's take a look here. Here's the final sentence, or final two sentences. Some scholars theorize that many Olmec construed the sudden change in the river's course and the resulting lack of crops as an omen, one that led the people to question the leadership. Now, it's what other scholars are thinking about this theory and these details. And then an explanation is offered up, a new explanation. Internal strife was the reason why the civilization disappeared. And that's the end of the short passage. But by understanding the trajectory, the way that the passage twists and turns from theory to theory is going to help you master these short passages and really be able to both anticipate the kind of questions they're asking and where to look in the passage once you go to those questions. In this lesson video, we are going to talk about an amazing technique that once you get really good at it, will make you much better at reading comprehension. This technique is called active reading. But before you do that, I want to show you something. It's this big, scary looking passage. I want you to actually pause the video, maybe for 15 or 20 seconds, and I just want you to start reading. And after you feel like you've read enough, unpause the video and we will talk. Okay, I'm going to speak, I'm guessing for most people. They start reading this, they kind of get the general idea that it's about the brain and how the brain changes, and somewhere around here, you feel like you're suddenly in this quicksand, you're just being pulled down, you're unsure about what's going on. And if someone were to suddenly take the passage away from you and ask you what was happening in that second paragraph, you would say something, oh, there's about this long word, a lugado, and they have lots of them in human brains, but in rat brains they're different. And what would likely happen is it would be very difficult for you to kind of tell someone what you were reading about. And that's on a more optimistic level, because you could very well say, I have no idea what I was reading. I was reading something about the brain, and then I started thinking about something totally unrelated to the passage, and then I realized, wow, I really don't like reading comprehension. So that could also have been your reaction. So let's now talk about this common approach and kind of flesh it out a little bit more before we get into active reading. What people tend to do is to just kind of rush into the passage. They see it and they start reading as fast as they can because, hey, it's a time test, and even in practice sessions, there's a sense of pressure and you want to get to the end as much as possible. And so what happens is you just start stringing words together. You don't slow down, you keep going, and you get to the end of the passage, and you're looking for this moment of enlightenment. Maybe at the very end, everything will just tie together, and that's not the case, and suddenly you have a bunch of questions that you have to deal with on a passage that you really didn't get. Active reading, on the other hand, is about making connections between the ideas and the text and really stopping for a second, pausing just a little bit to pick up on those ideas, to put those ideas in your own words, to simplify things, and then to make those connections. And in doing so, you're going to have a sense of the way that the passage is unfurling, and you're going to anticipate, oh, this is likely to happen next. And so when there are jumps in the passage, they're not altogether jarring because you have an idea of what the passage is likely to do. And of course, this goes back to those very first videos we did on the reading comp about the way that the passage is structured, that a theory is introduced and then it's disagreed with, evidence is provided, and then the author, maybe some other scholars, disagree with something in that evidence, and etc. Knowing that, of course, is part of active reading, so always make sure to pay attention to structure. And what you want to do, and of course it's very important to note that when I say each paragraph, what you want to do on the long passages is to create these mental snapshots. What I mean by that is when you get to the end of a paragraph, you hopefully have been extracting meaning and making sense of what you're reading and slowing down when necessary. And you should be able to come up with this mental snapshot, which is a simple, quick summary. Okay, this passage was about ABC. Now, ideally, those mental snapshots will be something you should do in your head, but for now, I encourage you to actually write down these mental snapshots. And we're actually going to take a passage here in a moment, a long passage, and you're going to use this mental snapshot technique that, again, is paragraph summary. And you'll also, of course, want to make connections between those paragraphs. But it's important to note, try writing it down unless you're really confident. And again, active reading is something that is used on the long passages because it's most successful there, but it's also something you want to apply to short passages as well. It's just the idea of mental snapshots for each paragraph doesn't hold as much. You want to, of course, just make connections between the ideas as you're reading through the short passage. But before we get to the long passage in this video, a little bit more about active reading and some tips that you want to follow. First off, do not try to absorb every single word, thinking that if you miss a single word, the meaning is going to completely fall apart. It's also, of course, going to slow you down. It's all about big picture, and I'm going to keep coming back to that phrase, big picture, or in this case, general meaning of the paragraph. That's the key. As long as you get those big nuggets of meaning and information, if someone were to come along and suddenly snatch the computer away from you or the page, you would be able to actually tell that person, well, tell them that they're a jerk, but tell them what the passage was actually about. And that's what we kind of want to get at as a test of understanding of the reading passage. Now, you do not want to get bogged down in details. And of course, trying to string every word together and rushing through to the end is a bad idea, but trying to slow down and reread something. Oh, I kind of lost the string of thought. I better reread that again. Well, sometimes that may make sense, especially if it's in the beginning and it's a big idea. But these passages are structured in such a way, as we'll see, that there's a lot of details in the middle, especially that last paragraph. And if you keep rereading something, because it's really dense, then you're going to forget the mental snapshots that you made towards the beginning. And so don't succumb to that urge to keep going back to the beginning of a sentence, but just keep reading, especially if it's towards the end, because that's what's going to happen. There's going to be a lot of detail, but if there's a question dealing with that detail, you'll be able to come back to that part of the passage. And of course, because you have a big picture idea of what's going on in the passage, those details will make sense. Another important thing is to notice these structure words. Structure words such as however, nonetheless, although, shift or pivot the meaning of what the author is saying. So this theory said ABC, however, or something like many scientists discovered this nonetheless. And so when you're paying attention to these structure words, you're noticing the direction of the passage. It's agreeing with one thing, but then it's going in another direction. And of course, that's where this big picture meaning comes from, and it's where a lot of the questions come from. This idea of, did you understand the shift in meaning in what the passage was saying? Sometimes they aren't always shifts, just simply adding on information. Or sometimes they are drawing conclusions, arriving at a result, and you'll see words like therefore, thus, and because. So make a little Rolodex of those not shift words, but structure words, so you can make sure that they don't surprise you and know that the first ones are for contrast, the second ones are for support, and the third one is this third batch here is to draw conclusions. Of course, you also want to remember the general structure of the passage. This is, again, applies to the long passage, of which there will always be one on the GRE, assuming you don't get an experimental section that happens to have one. But always remember the big picture. What are the paragraphs doing? What's the first paragraph doing? What's the second paragraph doing? And what's the third paragraph doing? And again, this is something that's happening at the mental level, where you pause for a moment before you dive into the questions and think, hey, I just read about this passage, and these were the three things that the passage did in general. Again, big picture across the three paragraphs. And it seems like the structure's pretty common or pretty typical. There's always 3 paragraphs, rarely 4 on that long passage that you will get on the GRE. Now, most active reading actually happens at the paragraph level, and I bolded that because I don't want people to get the idea that it's, oh, just really big picture, just get the general structure. Really, to understand what's going on, though, you have to understand that paragraph level. And that's why what we're going to be doing is taking these paragraph mental snapshots in a minute. Finally, and this is a big one, be excited. Why? Because these passages are really dull. And it's difficult to just get bogged down in the information and want to give up. These passages are dull and dry on purpose, and so you have to trick yourself into thinking, wow, this is really interesting. We're going to learn about brain plasticity and how it's different in rats and humans and what that means for humans and understanding our brains. This is really cool stuff. That's got to be your attitude, at least, well, for the passage we're about to read in a second, which is what it's about. But even if it's about artwork in 15th century Florence, get excited. So here we go. Here's the active reading exercise. I want you to read a paragraph without looking back at the paragraph. And this is important because anyone can kind of just look at it again and reread the words, and what's going to happen, your brain's going to get a little bit twisted. So don't look back at the paragraph, but read a paragraph. Try to make connections between the sentence. Think to yourself, oh, that sentence said this, and the next sentence is saying this. Make those connections. And then when you get to the end, look away, and on a piece of paper, write down a mini summary about that, what that paragraph was about. Again, big picture, big points within that paragraph. Don't just come up with a bunch of words you remembered reading, because you're going for meaning here. For example, defines plasticity, the brain's ability to change and grow in response to harm. Now again, we're writing this down. You don't want to do that test day because that would take a while, but this is just something you do in your head. That wouldn't take long at all. You want to repeat this with the next paragraph, and then at the very end, when you're done with the entire passage, you want to write down what the primary purpose is. And the purpose of this is most long passages will be followed by one question that asks exactly that. What was the primary purpose of the passage? So if you anticipate what that is and put it in your own words, the passage was about XYZ, you're far more likely to answer that question correctly. Okay, enough talking, and now you're going to be doing the doing. And what we have here is a passage. Let me show you the entire thing. Sorry to scare you, but that's the third paragraph. It's long and scary. This is about 450 words long. You're not going to get anything longer on the GRE, don't worry. But what you need to do, again, are these mental snapshots. Again, writing them down once you get to the end of each paragraph. And so I'm going to pause the video now, allow you to do so with these first two paragraphs. Then I'm going to unpause it, move to the third paragraph on the next slide, pause it again, and you should do a mini snapshot for that paragraph. So you should end up having 3 mini snapshots, and then finally write down what you think the primary purpose of that passage is. So I am pausing it. Okay, I'm unpausing it. I'm moving down to the slide below. I'm going to pause it again. Okay, I'm unpausing it. And actually, you're the ones pausing it, but hopefully that wasn't too tedious, and hopefully you remembered to be excited and to remain excited as you read through that. So let's do it now together. We're going to take each paragraph, and we're going to look for that big meaning as we move through the paragraph. Now the important thing here is I'm going to do a little bit more. I didn't expect you to write down all this, but I'm going to show you or simplify some of what's going on in the sentences in the beginning, so by the time we get to the end right here, we can come up with that mini snapshot. Okay, first off, it defines plasticity, the brain's ability to heal and grow. It's saying it's been the dominant view for a while, and now here's kind of the big picture. Here's what I want you to get out of here. Human brains may be even more plastic, again, here's the definition of plastic, than had been previously thought. That's all that paragraph 1 is really trying to say. Let's go to paragraph 2. A little bit longer, so I'm going to break up the sentences. And what we have here is I'm simplifying the sentence, and that's kind of what you're doing too when you're working through. You're not just, again, stringing words together, but you read a couple sentences, you get to that point, and you say, okay, I'm going to pause just ever so briefly and think, what did I just read about? How can I simplify that? And in written form, at least, I'm going to simplify things like oligodendrocytes into OD, myelin into MYE. And you probably want to do that in your head as well. The OD form, myelin, or my helps brain function. Human OD do not die, but they die in mice and rats. And there you go. That is a pretty good simplification, and you keep on reading. Secondary detail, maybe until now, basically mice and rats have been used to understand the brain. Next, we have this word rather. It shows us contrast going on there. So make sure to pay attention to a structure word like that. Humans barely lose any ODs, me simplifying this now. Rats can't use existing OD to replace myelin, need to make new ID. So humans, they don't lose ID, rats and mice do. They need to make new OD. That's all you need to do. And of course, the function of this entire sentence was elaborating on the first sentence. Notice again, that word rather, kind of showing you what the person or the author is actually trying to say. And finally here we have the last sentence. The implication is that the human brain is more prepared for trauma. And what does this mean? Again, I'm simplifying it. Human brain can quickly replace myelin so that it's more prepared. Thrown in a little inference here. When you get really good at this, you may be able to pick up on these inferences, such as the ability to quickly replace myelin is related to plasticity, which again, going back to the first paragraph, it's about the brain's ability to adapt and to heal. And finally, what I wanted you guys to do is to take that mini snapshot of the paragraph. And here we have, rats need to replace OD unlike humans. Human brains therefore more plastic. That's a pretty good mental snapshot, mini snapshot of paragraph 2. And so if you had something similar to this, that's fine. If you had something that was similar to what was simplified, that's fine. But your summary should have meaning that's similar to this. It can't just be you defining everything or just writing down a lot of words such as oligodendrocytes and brains. Again, what is it actually trying to say? And now paragraph 3, which I should mention is usually the most complicated. That's where you can get bogged down in the details, but that's where I encourage you to keep on reading. And many questions will come from here, so you can always go back to that part that the question is referencing and read again what those details mean, but of course in the context of actually answering a question. And the primary purpose of the passage can sometimes show up in the first paragraph, where you get a hint or a sense of that main idea, but it's really that last paragraph where the primary purpose is stated. So what I've done here is I've bolded the structure words, and I should have probably also added that it's in the last paragraph, in this third paragraph, that you'll see the most structure words. You'll see words like additionally, moreover, that are adding meaning, and you'll see, of course, these contrast words. I've also underlined what I think is important in terms of the meaning of the paragraph. And so when you're reading, and you get to the end here again, do that quick simplification, and then read on. So what did I come up with here? So here's the first batch of that long third paragraph. And simplified, I have plasticity can be defined by other factors besides OD. Ability of the brain to use both hemispheres is another factor that could be plasticity related. So it's not just about the ODs. And then they use supporting evidence, which is the stroke victims. And now I'm simplifying the next part. And here we have finds the connection between the OD and the speed of regeneration. Does that have anything to do with plasticity? And what we have also is that OD might play a part in how both hemispheres are used, so it is hard to determine how much plasticity. So your main snapshot for this paragraph may relate to both of these, but again, both of these is me simplifying what's going on, and you should also be kind of simplifying again in your head. But in general, this is a pretty good understanding or a pretty good summary of everything that was in the third paragraph. And now our primary purpose, write it down, should be something like the primary purpose of this passage is to talk about OD and myelin in terms of plasticity and regeneration in humans and how it differs from that in mice and rats. Reading comprehension is a difficult section because it takes a while to improve at. But if you use an approach and you fine-tune that approach over time, you will see improvements. What I'm going to do in this video is to teach you this approach. This approach is called the 5-step method, and it is how to deal not with reading the passage, which is active reading, but how to deal with the question. Very first step, go figure, read question. But in the context of number 2, it's going to make more sense. People like to read the question and immediately go to the answer choices. That is a no-no. That's problem number 1. Unless you are so good at reading comprehension and you are very confident, then fine, do that. But for the 99% of us, the others, we want to ignore the answer choices. The answer choices are not our friends. They are going to mislead us. They're going to confuse us. They are going to eat up our precious seconds. So ignore them. What do you do after ignoring the answers and reading the question? Well, sometimes the question can be confusing, and so you should paraphrase it. Then, you want to keep ignoring the answers. You want to go to the passage. Your job is to find the supporting text, the evidence that can back up the answer to the question. In other words, you are going to be answering the question in your own words before you even look at the answer choices. And that's kind of the big paradigm shift for a lot of people. For them, salvation awaits in the answer choices because then you can move on to the next question. But that's counterintuitive in the sense that it will actually take longer because you will spend a lot of time going back and forth between answer choices unless you use the RIPHA method. The RIPHA method, again, is to read, ignore, paraphrase, hunt, and then answer the question in your own words based on that supporting text. Once you've found it, once you've hunted through the passage, and you've used either the line reference to the question, or if there are no specific lines, you've looked at the words in the question, and then you've scanned the passage to find those words. And hopefully, if you've been actively reading, it shouldn't be that hard to find in the first place. Once you've done that, you can answer the question in your own words, and then go back and match your answer with the answer choices. So I guess maybe there'd be a final one, RIPHAM. That just sounds a little bit odd, so we'll call it RIPHA, but there would be that final thing of actually going back to the answer choices and matching. So what I have here is a question. What we're going to do is to follow this 5-step method. Okay, we have, according to the passage, how would those who study the brain likely view the idea that the brain can adapt and recover from injury? I don't know, it was so... That's what our brain wants to do. That's not the 5-step method. The 5-step method is to read this, make sure you understand it, and if it's not quite clear, paraphrase it. Because if you paraphrase the question and you have it in your head what it's asking, it's a lot easier to hunt through the passage knowing what to find. And when you find it, to answer the question in your own words. You don't have to keep going back to the question. So what we have here is people studying brain would think about, what about the fact that brain can recover from injury? Notice this isn't the most perfect grammatical sentence, but it's my paraphrase in my head, and it's going to help me answer the question. So again, people who study the brain, what would they think about this fact that the brain can recover from injury? Now, of course, we want to go where? Oh, okay, we want to go back here. Again, ignore. Why? Because we are going to hunt, and we're going to find that evidence, find that supporting text. And there it is. Long ago overturned and replaced, can and does heal itself remarkably in response to injury. Now, I'm getting kind of predictable here, so you know what I'm going to do. I'm going to mock the idea of going back to the answer choices because I still haven't done something. I still haven't put the supporting text into my own words. I haven't answered the question. How would people respond, people who study the brain? How would they respond to the fact that the brain can and does heal itself? Well, this was established long ago. This is something they know. Okay. It's something that they would accept or support. It's a given. They know this. And now I can go back and match. And so I look here at answer choice A, which, surprise, that doesn't match support and accept. It's kind of the opposite. They know this. Indignation. What are those extreme answer choices? Are they very angry? No, there's no sense of that. Aha, we have answer choice C with acceptance. Then we have answer choice D. And before we go to answer choice D, let's get rid of answer choice E. It's pretty clear it's not confusion. This is a long-established fact. However, when we go back to D, it can be a little bit confusing because you can kind of convince yourself that they would be indifferent somewhat. If they know this, it's been long established, then they don't care. Well, not really. They still care. That's not the best way of putting it. But unless you go through this step, it's easy to put D and to convince yourself that, yeah, this has been around for a long time, so they're going to say whatever. These are brain scientists, and this is an important fact. You're not asking them, what is the highest mountain in Madagascar? They probably don't care. Whatever. This is not a whatever fact. And I think you can agree with me now. However, if you don't go through these steps and you latch on to D without really thinking about your own word, then it's difficult to undo that logic, and you really want to go with D. D is not the answer. Clearly, C is the better answer. Okay, let's try this now. And instead of me going back to the answer choices and going da-da-da-da, ignore these, we're going to try something a little bit different. Here's the question. According to the second paragraph, in regards to myelin replacement, the brains of rats and mice primarily differ from those of humans in that they what? Well, we need to go back and find some supporting text. I'm not even going to give you the answers. That's the twist here. And that's how your brain should operate. You've read this question, you've paraphrased it, and you've gone to the supporting text. Now, I don't know if this question necessarily needs paraphrasing, which is fine. And we're going to go to the supporting text. And what we have here is the following. Rather, ODs, I'm shortening that, in human brains lose only 1 per 300 cells every year, a state contrasting greatly with that found in the brains of mice and rats, in which ODs are replaced every time the animal needs to produce more myelin. Okay, well, we can put that in our own words. Rats, mice need to replace OD in order to build myelin. It's all there. I've simplified all that text. And now I can go back to the answer choices. I want you to take about 15 seconds, you probably won't even need that much, to find the answer choice. Okay, did you see how you homed in on the correct answer? And I was hoping you paused it. Sorry if you didn't. That definitely wasn't 15 seconds. But there it is. There's a question of homing in versus reading each one. This sounds pretty good. No, I don't like that one. This could work. Do you see there's a process there that takes a lot longer, and that's where it's going to eat up a lot of time. Now, that's not to say the RIPHOM method is perfect in that you will always hone in on the correct answer. Oftentimes, you'll be between 1 or 2, and you may even need to go back to the supporting text. But it's going to be a lot faster than trying to weigh each answer choice, and worse yet, let those answer choices do the thinking for you.